Today, we will be looking at two horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. In the first one, a panicked caver wedges himself and loses his sanity. Eventually, his body starts to shut down. While in the second story, two people make a fatal decision of entering into one of the deadliest cave systems completely unprepared. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On January 10th, 1990, three people entered a lava cave in Hawaii for what should have been a relaxing experience in nature's own sauna. But when one member of the group became separated, things went from bad to worse to unimaginable. The lava cave near Route 137 in Opihikau, Hawaii's Puna district, had earned a reputation among locals as nature's own underground spa. This wasn't your typical tourist cave. It was a natural sauna with hot water pools and temperatures that reached 96 degrees Fahrenheit, 35 degrees Celsius. Formed by ancient volcanic activity when molten lava carved out a complex network of tunnels and chambers. On this particular Wednesday in January, three people decided to experience this natural wonder. Rodney Armour was 55 years old and visiting the area with his wife Jo as part of a retreat. They had brought along Mauve Fisher, probably a friend who knew about the cave's reputation as a natural sauna. The three arrived at the cave entrance, located in a natural sink that dropped 11 feet, 3.3 meters, from ground level. What they found at the bottom was the entrance to what locals called the Center of the Earth Cave, a name that would prove ominously appropriate. The cave's entrance was immediately challenging, an initial descending tube just barely big enough for a person's body to squeeze through. You had to crawl through a tunnel with rock pressing in from all sides, which could be incredibly intimidating. Once through that initial constriction, the cave opened up significantly. The narrow tube led to a stoopway where you could crouch while walking, then continued descending and enlarging into a walkway where people could stand upright. The cave system was extensive, described as being as large as a city block, with numerous small side passages branching off from the main routes, creating a maze-like environment. The heat was intense and constant at 96 degrees Fahrenheit, 35 degrees Celsius, with high humidity from hot water pools scattered throughout. For people seeking a sauna experience, this was perfect. But for anyone unprepared for such conditions, it could quickly become dangerous. Rodney, Jo, and Mauve began exploring the cave system using only flashlights with no specialized caving equipment. No ropes, helmets, backup lighting, or communication devices. This wasn't unusual for casual visitors to what was known locally as a relatively safe recreational spot. As the three moved through the hot, humid passages, something went wrong. At some point during their exploration, Rodney Armour became separated from his wife and Mauve Fisher. In a cave system as large as a city block, with numerous side passages, it would have been easy for someone to take a wrong turn or lose track of their companions in the maze-like environment. For Rodney, who was 55 and probably not in peak physical condition, being alone in the intensely hot environment would have been immediately stressful. But what happened next shows how panic can make people make decisions that defy all logic. Instead of staying put and calling out for his companions, or trying to retrace his steps back to where he last remembered being with them, Rodney began making increasingly desperate choices. In his panicked state, Rodney started moving deeper into the cave system, taking passages that led further away from the main routes. He was no longer thinking logically about navigation or safety. He was just desperately searching for any opening that might lead to an exit. Each turn seemed to promise escape, yet each turn only pushed him closer to disaster. The passages Rodney chose to explore were getting narrower and more restrictive. Instead of recognizing this as a warning sign that he was moving away from the main cave system, his panic-driven mind convinced him that these tight spaces might be shortcuts to the surface. Eventually, Rodney found himself approaching a particularly narrow constriction, a tube that angled downward diagonally into the rock. This was exactly the kind of passage that experienced cave explorers would avoid, especially when alone and without proper equipment. It was clearly leading deeper into the cave system, not toward any exit. Yet to Rodney's panicked eyes, it resembled a final chance at freedom. The thought of staying still was unbearable, so he plunged onward. But Rodney's rational thinking had been completely overtaken by panic and heat stress. He began squeezing himself into the constriction. As Rodney wedged himself into the diagonal tube, he quickly realized he had made a terrible mistake. The passage was barely wide enough for his body, with solid rock pressing against him from all sides. He couldn't turn around, couldn't back out easily, and couldn't move forward. He was effectively trapped in a stone coffin, angled downward in the suffocating heat. Helplessness spread like fire through his chest as reality sank in. The psychological impact of being wedged in this position was catastrophic. Panic set in completely. Rodney's breathing became rapid and shallow. His heart rate skyrocketed, and he began experiencing the full-blown panic attack that could ultimately kill him. He was hyperventilating in the hot, humid air. His body was overheating in the enclosed space, and his mind was consumed with the terror of being buried alive in the rock. His anxiety peaked to levels. Meanwhile, Joe and Mauve had realized Rodney was missing. They called out for him and searched the immediate area, but in a cave with numerous branching passages and constant echoes, their voices probably never reached him in his distant, narrow prison. After searching as long as they dared in the dangerous heat, Joe and Mauve made the difficult decision to exit the cave and call for help. They squeezed back through the body-size constriction and climbed out of the 11-foot sink. At 2:30 p.m., they reported Rodney missing. Their hearts must have been heavy, torn between fear and regret. The rescue operation was both urgent and incredibly challenging. Professional rescue teams knew they were dealing with a missing person in an environment where heat alone could be fatal. The intense heat made it impossible for rescuers to work for extended periods, so they organized their search in 20-minute shifts, rotating team members to prevent heat exhaustion. Their efficiency and training became a race against time itself. The rescue teams began systematically searching the cave system, following proper protocols and checking every passage and chamber. They were experienced in underground rescue operations, but even they were being pushed to their limits by the extreme heat and humidity. Sweat poured, muscles strained, but they pressed on with determination. When the rescuers finally found Rodney, the scene was both tragic and telling. He was wedged deep in the narrow diagonal passage, exactly where his panic-driven decisions had led him. His body was positioned head down in the constriction, trapped in the stone tube that had become his tomb. The hopeless silence of the rock confirmed his fate. It was immediately clear that Rodney had died from cardiac arrest. The combination of extreme heat, physical exertion, psychological terror, and the panic attack had overwhelmed his cardiovascular system. His heart had simply given out under the enormous stress of his situation. He was gone before help could reach him, sealed in the dark. The narrow passage where Rodney died told the story of his final moments. He had made a series of increasingly desperate and irrational decisions, driven by panic rather than logic, that led him deeper into danger rather than towards safety. The diagonal tube he had wedged himself into was clearly not an exit route. It was a dead-end passage that led nowhere but deeper into the rock, his final choice defined the outcome. The recovery operation was almost as challenging as the search. Rescue teams had to remove Rodney's body from the narrow diagonal passage while working in extreme heat. By 4:15 p.m., less than 2 hours after the initial report, they had successfully removed his body from the cave. Exhausted rescuers carried him out, burdened by both weight and sorrow. The medical findings suggest Rodney's death resulted from multiple factors. For a 55-year-old man who may not have been in peak condition, this combination of heat stress, physical exertion, and psychological panic created the perfect storm for a cardiac emergency. It was a tragic reminder that the human body has limits, and panic can push those limits to breaking. The physical demands of caving, especially in extreme environments like the heated lava cave, should not be underestimated. Even a recreational cave experience can put significant stress on the human body, and people with underlying health conditions need to be aware of these risks. On September 22, 1996, two recreational divers made a decision and chose to enter an underwater cave system without proper training, equipment, or guidelines. What happened next demonstrates exactly why cave diving is considered one of the most dangerous activities on Earth. Paradise Springs sits in Marion County, Florida, part of the extensive network of underwater cave systems that make Florida a world-renowned destination for cave diving. But like most Florida cave systems, Paradise Springs can be absolutely deadly if you don't know what you're doing. On this particular September day in 1996, two divers arrived at Paradise Springs for what they probably thought would be an exciting underwater adventure. These weren't professional cave divers or even cavern-certified recreational divers. They were open water divers, people who had basic scuba certification for diving in open ocean or lake environments, but no specialized training for the unique dangers of underwater caves. Here's the thing about open water diving versus cave diving. They're completely different activities that require completely different skills, equipment, and mindsets. Open water diving takes place in environments where you can always swim directly to the surface if something goes wrong. Cave diving takes place in overhead environments where there's no direct route to the surface, and one mistake can trap you underwater until your air runs out. The two divers made their first critical error before they even entered the water. They decided to explore the cave portion of Paradise Springs without a guideline. In cave diving, guidelines aren't just recommended equipment, they're absolutely essential survival tools. A guideline is literally a rope or line that cave divers lay behind them as they penetrate into a cave system, providing a direct route back to the entrance even in zero visibility conditions. Without a guideline, cave divers are essentially playing Russian roulette with their lives. If visibility gets compromised for any reason, and it almost always does, you can become instantly lost in an underwater maze with no way to find the exit before your air supply runs out. But these two open water divers didn't understand this fundamental principle of cave diving safety. They entered the cave portion of Paradise Springs without any form of navigation aid, relying on their ability to remember the route back to the entrance and maintain visual contact with their surroundings. The divers descended into the cave system, going deeper and deeper into the limestone passages. They reached a depth of 148 feet, 45 meters. A significant depth that would have put them well inside the cave system, far from any natural light and completely dependent on their artificial lighting to see anything. At 148 feet deep inside an underwater cave, these divers were in one of the most dangerous environments imaginable. They were in an overhead environment with no direct route to the surface. They were at a depth where nitrogen narcosis could impair their judgment, and they were completely dependent on their equipment functioning perfectly. Then, disaster struck in the form of a silt-out. Silt-outs are one of the most feared scenarios in cave diving. They occur when the fine sediment on the cave floor gets stirred up by divers' fins, equipment, or movements, creating a cloud of particles that reduces visibility to absolute zero. When a cave gets silted out, it's like someone turned off all the lights in an underwater maze. You literally cannot see your hand in front of your face. The two divers apparently caused a massive silt out at 148 feet deep inside Paradise Springs. Whether they kicked the bottom too hard, bumped into a wall, or made some other movement that disturbed the sediment, the result was catastrophic. The clear water that had allowed them to navigate into the cave was suddenly replaced by a thick cloud of silt that made navigation impossible. In zero visibility conditions, the male diver apparently became separated from his partner. This is another nightmare scenario in cave diving. Losing contact with your dive buddy when you can't see anything means you're now completely alone in an underwater cave with no way to navigate back to the entrance. The male diver, probably panicking and disoriented by the complete loss of visibility, began searching frantically for a way out of the cave. Without a guideline to follow, he was essentially swimming blind through an underground maze, hoping to stumble across the exit before his air ran out. In his desperate search for an escape route, the diver made a fatal error. He attempted to squeeze through what he thought might be a passage leading toward the entrance, but instead wedged himself into a small crack or crevice in the cave wall. Once he was stuck in this tight space, he found that he couldn't move forward or backward. Picture this terrifying scenario. You're 148 feet underwater in complete darkness, trapped in a rock crevice that's just barely big enough for your body, with no guideline to show you the way out, and a finite air supply that's ticking down with every breath. The psychological terror of this situation would be overwhelming. Meanwhile, his diving partner was experiencing her own nightmare. She saw her companion disappear into the silt cloud, and then witnessed what appeared to be a cave collapse. From her perspective, it looked like the ceiling of the cave had fallen in and crushed her dive buddy. Believing that her partner was dead, and that the cave structure was unstable, she made the decision to ascend to the surface to get help. The female diver's ascent to the surface and call for help probably saved her own life, but it also meant that her partner was now completely alone in his underwater prison, with no one knowing his exact location or predicament. When emergency responders arrived at Paradise Springs about an hour later, they immediately began organizing a cave rescue operation. Professional cave diving rescue teams are equipped with specialized equipment, extensive training, and the experience needed to navigate dangerous underwater cave systems safely. The rescue divers entered the cave system following proper cave diving protocols. They laid guidelines behind them as they penetrated into the system, maintained proper visibility techniques to avoid creating silt outs, and worked systematically to locate the missing diver. When the rescue team found the trapped diver, they discovered that he was wedged in a small crevice deep in the cave system. However, their initial attempts to extract him were unsuccessful due to the difficulty of maneuvering in the tight space and the complexity of the extraction process. The rescue teams called in the NSS Cave Diving Section Recovery Team, a specialized group of expert cave divers who handle the most difficult underwater recoveries. When this elite team arrived and began their own investigation, they made a discovery that changed the entire understanding of what had happened. The cave had not collapsed, as the female diver had believed. Her partner had not been crushed by falling rocks. Instead, the recovery team found evidence of what had actually occurred in those final, desperate moments. The trapped diver, wedged in the crevice and probably running low on air, had apparently convinced himself that he could not get free from his rocky prison. In what must have been a moment of absolute panic and desperation, he made a decision that sealed his fate. He released his diving harness, somehow managed to back out of the crevice that had been holding him prisoner, and then began what's called a free ascent, swimming toward the surface while holding his breath, without any artificial light to guide him. A free ascent from 148 feet, 45 meters underwater, is extremely dangerous under the best of circumstances. The diver would have had to hold his breath while swimming upward through a complex cave system, navigating in complete darkness, trying to find passages that led toward the surface rather than deeper into the cave. The tragic irony is that by releasing his harness and backing out of the crevice, the diver had actually freed himself from his trap. If he had remained calm, kept his diving equipment, and followed proper emergency procedures, he might have been able to survive long enough for the rescue teams to extract him. But panic and desperation drove him to make a series of decisions that turned a potentially survivable situation into a fatal one. Swimming upward in complete darkness through an underwater cave system while holding your breath is essentially impossible. The diver would have quickly become disoriented, run out of breath, and drowned in the flooded passages. The recovery team found his body at approximately the 44-foot, 13-meter level, suggesting that he had managed to swim partway toward the surface before succumbing to drowning. He had come tantalizingly close to reaching shallower water, but not close enough to save his life. The Paradise Springs tragedy illustrates several critical lessons about cave diving safety. First, open water diving certification is completely inadequate preparation for cave diving. Second, guidelines are not optional equipment in cave diving. They are essential safety tools that can mean the difference between life and death when visibility is compromised. Third, panic is often more dangerous than the original emergency in cave diving situations. The trapped diver might have survived if he had remained calm, conserved his air, and waited for rescue teams to extract him. His decision to abandon his equipment and attempt a free ascent turned a difficult rescue into a fatal accident.